There is no one-size-fits-all or a simple fix when it comes to your well-being. Hi, my name's Josephine, founder of Positivity Center and Wellbeing Consultant, and a person figuring out how to be my best. So join me in conversation with friends, sharing what works for them, and then listen to what works for others so you can create something that will work for you. Hello, and welcome to the show today. This is kind of an interesting one. I'm calling you from Cancun, Mexico. Well, actually Tulum on the Mayan Riviera. And I'm pleased to connect with my friend from across the ocean, David. Hello and welcome, David.
Hi, great to be in touch. And yeah, a long way from the UK to Mexico.
No kidding.
And not when I thought it was going to be Canada. So yeah, great.
You thought I just surprised you because this trip was basically booked about, I don't know, not even 36 hours before we came. It was just a miracle.
The world's shrinking all the time. Yeah.
Well, and sometimes the things we plan aren't working out these days. So yeah, just go with it and be spontaneous. And yeah. So maybe you could introduce yourselves to our viewers and tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into how we know each other. And maybe that's a part of the introduction.
Yeah, that could take hours, so I better think of a short way to introduce myself.
I know.
Obviously, my name's David. I'm a gay man. I've been with my partner 32 years. We have a daughter and two grandsons. And I have worked in the field of dementia care for scarily 42 years. And in October of last year, took up a role as professor within the first title in the UK, Professor of Emotion Intelligence in Care at York St John University. And that was through that then how we made our first connection.
No kidding. Well, I had heard about your previous work in dementia just because I was working within communities that were certified in your model. And I remember watching elders, feeling very uncomfortable to sit on furniture. And then when they changed all the furniture, I clearly remember that one day I came in and there was a gentleman just laying down on the couch with his feet up, just as if he was at home, really, legitimately. So it's cool to see some of the quality of life changes that happen as a result.
Yeah, and that began right back, really. I suppose it goes right back to my childhood and teenage years and growing up. And I think when we had our first conversation, I talked about how heart disease was a major feature in my family, with everybody dying before 40. And so I grew up from an 8-year-old, when there was a policeman at the door to tell my mum my dad had died and she was a widow with me and a baby. I grew up from age 8 onwards knowing that life and people were vulnerable. And that exposes you to growing up in a very different way and a very different view of time and the pace of life and feelings. And I began to realize that people saw me as a highly emotional young guy, and that they didn't quite know what to do with all that emotion. And then obviously I went to university and I started working with people with dementia, and I'd had two grandmothers with dementia. And I started to become very driven about it. And it took me a few years later to understand what that was about, but I became very driven about the rawness of an experience in dementia care. And perhaps, as I said, later in life, I also identified that rawness was tapping into something in myself. But the rawness was about, why isn't everybody screaming that this isn't okay? To arrive in your first job and to arrive to double-handled locked doors with faces pressed at a glass window, and a nurse the other side saying, I'll have to unlock. And then as she unlocks, these people all standing, staring at you as you squeezed in because they don't really want to open the door fully. And then them shutting the door and seeing 2 rows of iron beds and people naked and people screaming. And as if no one was saying, but this isn't right. This cannot be anything on any level human right was such a shock, because I was only 22. And then I began to realize, no, this is the nature of dementia care all over the country. All these hospitals, all these places are like this, and no one's screaming that it needs to stop. But in fairness, I worked with the first professor of dementia care in the UK, and his words to me were, "You're here to shut this place down with me." And through working with him, realised that there were people, even 40 years ago, who realised it all had to change. And so I then went on this huge 40-year life journey about trying to change it, but realising that that change is highly difficult, because the levels of institutionalization are not just in buildings, they're not just in systems and routines and processes, they're actually in all our minds. And that actually, that's the thing. And it's weird, really, to end up as a professor of emotional intelligence and care, because perhaps I should have been on that journey for 40 years. And perhaps I've been doing it all back to front, but it's taken me 40 years to realize that.
So it just makes me think about what the well-being is like for those who are in care, because that is a major focal point right now, especially when the pandemic hit. And I didn't see it, like there's some decades that separates us in terms of when I first saw what it was like to be in an institution or facility. And so I didn't see, rows of beds, people naked. I did see people screaming and locked doors and faces pressed against the glass and that kind of thing. So what did it speak to you about the level of their well-being at that time and where you wanted to see it go?
Yeah. I mean, 40 years ago, when I saw those and felt those experiences, it was a mystery to me that people didn't see the complete lack of humanity. And then, I spent 40 years trying to, along with many other people, try to advocate. My strapline at the time was feelings matter most, because feelings matter most to all of us every minute, every day. Why were feelings not mattering most in dementia care? Why was it more about containment and risk and security? The answer is because that was also about feelings in people who were very scared of reaching people and very scared of enabling people, and therefore their own feelings of insecurity was to shut everything down. And that's what was so scary 40 years on from trying to be part of a major culture change movement was, when I reflect on the pandemic, I always used to say that the old culture of care was waiting on the back of our necks to just grab us again. And that for all the years of people advocating meaningful occupation, emotional connection, focusing on people's strengths, changing the environment towards dementia design, I did know that it would take so little for everything to go right back again to 40 years ago. And that is really hard, because also in the pandemic, people gave, and I'm talking staff here and volunteers, people gave their heart and soul to the care of people in the pandemic in the most extreme circumstances, where they were then having to go home utterly emotionally exhausted, back to their own children, wondering about the risks of going to and from home and work, seeing, large-scale loss and death. But although that was being given by individuals in the care sector, the system, as a pandemic response, went back, as we saw in Canada through the army going in and making reports of what they saw. It went back to total shutdown, total containment. Nothing else matters other than decreasing COVID risk, as if actually we wouldn't then be killing people anyway. And that we wouldn't be killing their souls before COVID even got them through infection control. So I'm sort of still processing the last 2 years as to how did, in a culture of care where there were thousands of people like you and I, who had seen what the new cultures of care could enable, how did they all also, with their heart and soul giving, which they were giving, enable themselves to also become the victims of a system of control, where government control, infection control, was all that mattered.
Yeah.
Rather than saying it matters, but it's only one piece of the jigsaw.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we're not saying that doesn't matter. That's pretty clear. Yeah, I had a client during that time. And of course, being an emotion coach, I was shut off from being able to see him. And it was, I couldn't believe when they finally did open up the doors for people to come back in. Very, very small opening, but because he didn't have family, I was able to see him. And his cognitive decline was immense in 3 months, immense. And he, prior to 3 months, he could have an emotional conversation with me from start to finish. When I went back, no, it wasn't possible anymore. He had just digressed so much cognitively that I actually couldn't provide him that professional service anymore, because he cognitively couldn't follow me, just dropped off so much. And so, I'm not a scientist, that's one client, and but I'm getting that you saw that too, is that there was the quality of life, the well-being that we talk about, that mindset, right, does so much for people who are living in care, because the care meets basic needs for sure. It was starting to rise up to meet more than basic needs, right? They were trying to provide that quality of life and to really ensure that emotional well-being was taken care of. So where do you, with the work you're doing now, where do you hope that the well-being piece will go? Especially for elders in care.
I've just had an article published on this in the Journal of Dementia Care, where I sort of said I haven't got another 40 years in this new role. But what I suppose I'm trying to say to people is this: emotional intelligence is not the same as emotional giving. I have no doubt of the extremity of the millions of hours of emotional giving that occurred during the pandemic. But I am questioning whether there were equal millions of hours of emotional intelligence. Because would emotional intelligence have really led to restricting people to the degree of ill-being that we did again? i.e., you and I, every human being in the world during the pandemic, were faced with a range of choices. It wasn't an all or nothing scenario. It was a range of choices of, well, am I going to stand in a street neighbourhood meet in the middle of the road on a Saturday morning at a distance, at a social distance like we're required, because I need human contact and I need to feel part of the community? Or am I going to stay in my house because my fear is too great to stand in the street in the fresh air? There were choices about, when we were allowed with the government to see people and to see my grandchildren, and a whole discussion with my daughter about, but children may be carriers, and what would that mean for you, David, with heart disease and a quadruple heart bypass? And my well-being was, Chloe, that doesn't even arise. My need to see Harry and Finlay, I can choke even as I remember it, is huge. And therefore, of course, I'm going to see them. Now we're allowed, even though I know there are some risks. Those risks don't even feature in a scale of well-being or ill-being. And so what I'm puzzled at about the lack of emotional intelligence is that, and I'm not puzzled in some ways, that people living with dementia were not afforded the complexity of those choices about their well-being. Because I believe some people with dementia would have chosen complete lockdown, complete restriction, seeing no one, not seeing relatives, etc. But I know there's a lot of people living with dementia who, faced with a range of choices that I believe they could have understood, would have made choices that infection control wouldn't have agreed with, the government wouldn't have agreed with, but they'd have, in their way, said, I need to feel, I need to live, I need to love. And therefore, I cannot bear a possibility of living just in a bedroom.
Yeah.
Or just with people wearing, spacesuits.
Suits. Yeah.
Who decided that people with dementia were no longer to be the people like the rest of us who had degrees of choices?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's because emotional intelligence disappeared at government level and disappeared at infection control level, and that the cultures of care that we have come from in the history of dementia care are still so powerful. Like I'd always said, they were ready to grab us, and they were ready to grab compassionate staff and inspiring leaders and suppress them and make them just join the oppressive culture again.
Okay, so what's coming into my mind, I completely agree. What I see is that there was a choice between living minutes just to live out the minutes left in your life and extend that for as long as possible, and living moments of connection. And that's where the emotional intelligence lies. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I mean, emotional intelligence is, you and I know what it means in terms of like how we experience emotions, how we label them, recognize them, move through them. How do you explain emotional intelligence to people so that they become more aware of that alternative lens, that alternative mindset that can help with choice making, so we can live more moments of connection and less just live minutes of them?
And I think that's the complexity of it, isn't it? That, emotional intelligence was around in the 1960s. It's had its fads, it's come and gone. It's been adopted in some industries a lot more than in health or social care. I would describe it quite simply as it is about the ability to, it's not about being emotional, and it's not about just emotionally pouring out and giving. Because there are millions of human beings who are emotional and millions who emotionally give. That's not emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to interpret and navigate your own emotions and your own emotions in relation to others, and also to separately process someone else's emotions and interpret what they might not be, and to then find a path that is about uncluttering self, so that actually why emotional intelligence I think is scary in a range of work settings is because people are frightened there'll be an emotional tsunami come from everybody. Whereas it's quite the opposite. What actually happens is that people become freed up, they become genuine, they become authentic, because they have been given permission to be whole and truly themselves. And then from that comes a quality of relationship between a leader and a member of staff, between two colleagues, between a colleague and a visitor or family member, or between ourselves and our own partner or our own child. A level of relationship that understands the core of us, that my emotional intelligence comes from loss, pain, a fear of being alone in life. How would you, with or without dementia, in a chronic state of ill-being, how would you be reached? And my whole working life had been about this person must be reached. If they're banging at the door with dementia, if they're screaming out, help me, if they're calling for their mother at 92, they're asking to be reached. And that's just the same as any of us. And just the same as when I was saying to Peter, I need a dog. I was really saying to him, I need to be reached. But what if I was someone who couldn't have said to my partner, I need to be reached? What if I'm a 92-year-old calling for my mother, and the staff don't know that that means that I don't need my mother, I need the feelings my mother gave me from you, the care worker, the nurse. so the great dilemma about emotional intelligence is the vulnerability that it exposes, because you have to be prepared to not believe others are vulnerable, other people with dementia are vulnerable, other people in the care sector are vulnerable with staff, but to say, no, 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 we're all a flicker away and it's chance. And so I'm going to try and reach you as a care worker, you as a manager, you as a director of a board, you as a person with dementia, you as a family member. I'm going to try and reach you through what some people think is scary, but scarily bogus, or scarily, is it to be believed? Is this guy really who he is when he's emotional, when he's crying, when he's talking about vulnerability, when he's talking about risk in his own life, on his feelings and his ill-being? And it's a bit like people have to understand that there's no fine line between us and them. We're all us. You know, someone said to me when I was appointed in October at the university, how can that be? How have you gone from this place in the last year and they've decided to appoint you as a professor? But even that told me where the whole world is on emotional intelligence. Somebody asked that, because it was like trying to unvalidate the role or the appointment. It was saying, well, you're now one of the other. And because you're one of the other, you can't be then a professor.
Right.
And it was like, really? Are you really saying that to me? Because it's not that I'm being a professor of engineering or, you know, computers. Are you really saying in healthcare to me that I can't be a professor of emotional intelligence in care because I've been to a dark, bad place and had to find a way to scramble and claw out? What's that about? Do we really think people in dementia in a care home are any different to us? Do we really think people in a hospital with mental health needs are any different to myself?
Yeah.
But people are scared of it. People are frightened of it in workplaces.
Yeah.
They're frightened of it in workplaces. They feel it's crossing professional boundaries that are not to be crossed.
Yeah. I have so many questions. The one thing I wanted to ask you quickly, because I can see a lot of parallels between all the work that you did and how you viewed dementia care and people wanting to be reached. I really like how you say that, people want to be reached. And then you went through many personal, not just one, but multiple personal experiences where you needed to be reached. You reached yourself, but I mean, obviously you had people that loved you around that helped, even though it didn't seem that those were the relationships that necessarily got to the core of what it was that needed to be reached in you. But, you know, they helped to, you know, clear some space. Otherwise, you know, I think sometimes, what does that speak to with regards to the connection and what it's got to do with emotional intelligence?
Professor Tom Kitwood wrote about, when he wrote his, you know, seminal book about Dementia Reconsidered, and he talked about, you know, the flower. And in the flower there was, you know, love, belonging, security, attachment, the basic human needs that go back, you know, in the 1960s into psychotherapy.
Yeah.
But actually, if we're going to do any good in health or social care, it's not to others. It's not to others. That actually, I talk and write a lot about emotional labor, that we're asking of people a degree of emotional labor, a degree of emotional connection to reach someone else in the way I've described about myself or the way I've described about a person with dementia. And if we're going to ask that level of emotional connection of someone and that level of emotional labor from them, people will need filling up again. The reason I got depressed twice in my life was because you could say, you know, circumstances or myself failing to see it or what others did to me, I ended up going to a place of being empty and not seeing that I was going to the empty place, that the tap was draining and there was hardly anything left. And that actually, in health and social care, that risk is huge. That people are now leaving in the UK. I don't know in Canada, but they're leaving.
Yeah, same here.
They're leaving in droves since the pandemic. There's a massive national recruitment crisis and a massive retention crisis. And I've talked about and written about this and saying, this is not rocket science. We were asked by the government to clap for heroes on the street, and we clapped with wholehearted, zealous, praise of what we knew was going on in hospitals and the care sector. But the irony of the clapping was then, as the pandemic starts to level out, people get a pathetic 1% pay rise and then be thanked for everything they've done the last 2 years. And we don't think that level of emptying and that level of lack of response to their emotional labour won't lead to a recruitment retention crisis. Mm-hmm. So I would say that the whole health and social care at the moment is paying the price of lack of connection to staff. Mm-hmm. And it will only turn round when directors of boards that address the very first thing, not the amounts they're spending on PPE equipment, not the amounts they're spending on their food budget, not the amounts they're spending on the design of their new builds, but what are they doing to design an emotional labour strategy that's core to the organisation first, before they tackle any other part of being a care provider.
Yeah, I know. We don't need another model of care, folks. I just keep thinking that over and then. Like if we just keep going that route and changing the colors and the design and what's inside the buildings, and we don't actually fill our staff, like the organization from the inside out, and apply emotional intelligence with them too.
Yeah. And that
it's not going to go very far, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that dichotomy of what you ask staff to give and be.
Yes.
And then what they expected how to be at work.
Yeah.
A professionally detached, professionally constrained, boundaried. It's a complete mismatch and a dichotomy that I think for the first time the pandemic has actually exposed it.
Yeah. Have you come across the work on compassionomics?
On compassion?
It's called compassionomics.
No.
So there's a physician in the US, it's Dr. Stephen Trizek, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but they were doing some lit reviews on compassion and the fact that there's a compassion crisis, and the compassion is a component of emotional intelligence. One of the things they found was that a brain in an MRI, if it was experiencing empathy, it lit up the pain centers of the brain. And if it was experiencing compassion, it was the reward centers of the brain that got lit up. And so what they're trying to put out there for healthcare is to say, which I think kind of resonates a little bit with what you're saying, if we only ever feel empathy, which is the feeling of someone else's emotions, and we stay in that, it's very draining, right? Mm-hmm. That's the pain center being lit up. Whereas if we move over to the compassion part, which he said is the action-oriented part of, being emotionally connected to somebody, that, you feel their emotion and then it turns to compassion where you actually act on it. So that's the response to, the interpretation and the emotional connection between yourself and you and the person that you are with in that care setting. Then that's when the reward centers light up. And so to me, when I hear you talk, that comes to my mind, because I think that's got to be part of the key in care, to not be doing this to people, and also to not be giving, constantly feeling like you just give away. But that in that moment when you are in care, in a connection with somebody, when it's rooted in connection, there's this beautiful, I see a circle of giving and receiving and giving and receiving. So in turn, there's never just a giving up where you have an empty bucket, but there's a giving. And then when you notice the things that you are receiving at sometimes simultaneously, or, in reflection, if you don't have time in the moment, what it is that you have received. And sometimes I ask caregivers, what has the person that you care for given to you? Mm-hmm. Because there's something that they've given to you, like, whether it's feeling a purpose or a sense of meaning or a smile or, a nugget of wisdom, whatever it was that they're sharing with you. Do we reflect on those? Do we incorporate those into what it means to be in healthcare or social care and be in those connections of care with other people.
Yeah, I used to do a similar exercise where I'd get people to draw around their own hand. And I'd get them to draw around their own hand twice, and then get them to write in one hand everything they wanted to give the person they were supporting, and then secondly to write in the second hand, what the person or people are giving back to them.
Yeah.
But I think that applies to organisations as well.
Yeah, yeah.
That I think we are far enough on in the culture of person-centred care. In the UK, person-centred care is now 30 years old. There's a whole, it's in every care home brochure in the country, every philosophy statement, but we're at a point where actually there's got to be a reckoning on this 30 years on. So, why is it still proving difficult in many areas of the sector to implement, to regulate, to inspect, to train on? And I think that's why I'm focusing now on this new role, because I believe the missing piece has always been about that a culture of person-centred care is about building it brick by brick with the team and the staff and the leadership first, before giving it outwards to others who equally need to receive it and give back to us. That if it's all about giving it one way into a sector by the staff, that then the only options staff are left with are numb out, burn out, or get out. Yeah. And of course, that's what we're now seeing occur.
Yeah.
And I'm not yet seeing the level of tidal wave in HR, in board responses of, yes, this is complete common sense, and we've got to, if we want to stop the numb out, burn out, get out, we've got to reframe this organisation. What does it really mean to be a person-centred organisation? What does it really mean to be an HR department who actually drives everything first through an emotional labour lens? Yeah. In the way it advertises, in the way it recruits, in the way it supports staff. Yeah. What does it mean in terms of education? So there's that, and I still don't see the sector adopting emotional intelligence in the same way many industries do. And I don't see health and social care as an industry, I hate the word. But in parallel other work fields, there are massive advances in production lines, in all sorts of areas of work, where they have realized that it's emotional intelligence that gets them the best product, the best quality hospitality experience, etc., etc. What is this strange, weird hesitation in the very sector where it should be core to make it core? And I have to say that has to be about old professionalization, old cultures of training, old cultures of what it means to be a professional, that marry up still with the double-handed doors and the locked doors 40 years ago, that people are still abiding, if not by the physical constraints, by their own mental constraints of what they think a professional is. Do people listening to this think I am a professional professor as they would expect? Or do they think, oh, he sounds a bit off the wall, he sounds a bit like always too wrapped up in his own emotional life and brought it into work, he sounds like he's using his emotions too much in how he's talking, this feels, as one person said, it sounds like he's a bit emotionally manipulative, and I've heard it all, and I know all the angles. And you can't necessarily change the people who are going to have those sorts of responses to you. But it tells me a lot about the sector. Because if we've got thousands of those people still in it, boy, I thought dementia care could change in 40 years. Yeah. Well, our cultures of care towards staff really going to change in 40 years if we've got thousands of people who believe that stuff. Yeah.
That's just why I want to build it all new. So bringing in staff that are, they say, it's not just a job, it's a calling. Often, like in healthcare, they say that. And to assume that, and that staff are intrinsically motivated and will remain so without us doing anything is improper. That's totally incorrect. We cannot keep going forward that way, because that's the way we've been going forward. Just assuming you're intrinsically motivated, you chose this job because it was a calling for you, so you're good. We don't need to worry about your purpose, the meaning behind why you do what you do, blah, blah, blah. But there obviously is, being intrinsically motivated doesn't mean it's just always there. It still is a bucket that has to be filled. So, and no matter what we do on the outside in terms of the environment, if we don't change the inner constructs, that mindset, then we don't change how we care with and for people. So what would you say? Because we could go on for hours, but what would you say would be a way forward, from your lens, with not a meta view, because we get that emotional intelligence is a part of that, but more of that micro view. What are some small things that organizations can do, or perhaps even individuals can do for their own well-being to help them shift?
Yeah. And I think you're right, because there's such massive macro issues around how boards are constructed, how, what forms of regulation could pressurize change, etc. And I won't go there. But actually, that's where the greatest energy will have to be adopted, because otherwise it falls to individuals who will always feel that they're in a culture that's strangulating them. Mm-hmm. But in the micro, what can you do? I think it's why I created if you go onto my website, there's a one sheet there called About Me, and it asks you to write 6 words under different headings. And I've done it about me, so you can read it, and there's all these different headings, and there's 6 words. And, off the top of my head, I know that one of the words about me is flawed. Another word is vulnerable. Another word is, grandfather. There's a whole range of words about me, but I didn't do it just to have on my website as a way of describing myself. It was also to say to people, what about doing that as a staff team? What about actually taking that sheet off the website, blanking it, but with the headings, and saying we're going to do it together with our leader, with our manager, and let's actually see, with the veil off, what are the 6 words under all these headings that we would actually, and let's see what might the surprises be. What might the words be that you thought, I've never known that about you ever.
Right.
I would never have thought you'd write that word. Yeah. I think sometimes it's about starting the conversation that says, it's going to be okay, because we're going to shed the job roles, we're going to shed the titles. If a professor can do this, anybody can do it. We can just be me, but in a new way with each other at work, in a new way as a team. And let's just start and see where that goes as a first off. Yeah. I think the other way is for managers and leaders to actually model that themselves. So if you don't feel able to facilitate that in a team meeting or with a team, is to do that one-to-one, is to say to a team member in a supervision support session, I'd like you to know about me, and here I fill this in, and it's not compulsory for you to do it, but I'd like you to think about if you would do it. I'd like you to think about, even if you don't share with me your words, I'd still like you to think about what would be your words in private that you would write down. Yeah. I think it's about that sort of dialogue. It's about, it's like Brené Brown, is huge in the States about vulnerability. Yeah. It's about saying, this is a workplace. It's not only going to say we support vulnerability, we're actually going to be it. We're going to talk it. We're going to actually know when it happens. And we're also going to know that it's the vulnerability in us that's the brilliant thing about us, that's the best about us, even when it feels like it's breaking us.
Yeah. And then that translate, I could just see that rippling to how conversations happen when, especially with new residents, how they typically do a move in, and what's your favorite color? What hobbies do you have? How many kids do you have? Let's get past that. Let's go deeper. Let's actually connect with who we are as humans.
Yeah. And I'm 64. And when I did that exercise, which I did only last October. And, I'm supposed to be someone who has a degree of self-knowing, though obviously you've already heard it comes and goes. But what was really interesting was that I also wrote, and I remember one of the things I wrote was a fear of goodbyes. And one of the things I've been very poor at in my work life is to say goodbye well to people, to do it well, to feel it well. I've often shut down on someone leaving a job or leaving the workplace because I realized I couldn't deal with the endings. And, only because I wrote that down on that being me sheet, did the realization come at 64. As I wrote the words fear of goodbyes, which I'd never written about myself before. And I thought, of course you have a fear of goodbyes. You had to say goodbye to a father at 8 years old, to his twin brother, your uncle, to everybody dying of heart attacks. You had to sit in a hospital and your partner and daughter be told he's less than 4 weeks to live. He's 46, he's not going to make it. And to actually say, it's okay, we'll find a way to say goodbye if this isn't going to work. If I don't make it in a month's time to a quadruple heart bypass. And I realized the fear of goodbyes was a sudden incredible revelation at 64. You're really bad at doing goodbyes well with friends, with family, with work colleagues. Why is that? So emotional intelligence, you don't just have it.
Yes.
It grows. It grows through experiences. It grows through meeting other people who challenge or question or support. It's a process to commit to, that you commit to because you want to be whole, you want to be true. And that might mean also at times being lonely or not having the people around you because they don't get you. And that'll be okay. This isn't something where you wrap yourself with a massive circle of people because you're emotionally intelligent. I've also realized sometimes emotional intelligence can lead to at times quietness, withdrawal, isolation, because there's a bridge and people aren't crossing to you and you're stuck and you don't know how to cross to them, because it's like suddenly you're not speaking the same language and they don't even know what your language is. And that's the dilemma for the whole of health and social care, is how do we get emotional intelligence in care as a language we all know and feel?
Well, we learn to say goodbye well, because if we don't fear saying goodbye and we can let go of everything that we fear to lose, then we'll live and give people the choice that they deserve, ourselves and others. So thank you so much, David. I think that's just such a great way to end the show and just say goodbye well.
Yeah, and how amazing that, this is an example, isn't it? Two people have never known each other, made a connection, realized they were speaking a similar language, felt able to, from knowing nothing, say, this is the place I've been in, Josephine, this is where I am. I'm putting it out there because I can't be anything, I can't start anything with you in a work relationship till you know who I am inside.
Yeah.
And here it is.
And that's exactly how we started. And I look forward to the places we'll go because we started that way. Yeah. Absolutely. Very warmly. Thanks,
Wish
David.
Wish you well in Mexico. Enjoy your holiday.
Sure will.
Okay. Take care.
Bye. Thanks for listening to Wellbeing That Works. Before you go, take 1 minute to write down your takeaway from today's guest. And be sure to download our Wellbeing Evaluation Sheet to help you along your wellbeing journey. And if you've got something to share to inspire others, be sure to be a guest on our show. Until next time, with love and kindness.